Welcome to the Texas News Podcast, where we dive into all things Texas and the future of independence in the great state of Texas. On today's show, I'm going to be interviewing Javier Hernandez, a leading advocate for the independence of the U.S. territory of Puerto Rico. We're going to be talking about a lot of the history behind the independence movement in Puerto Rico, some exciting developments that have happened just over the last few days, and the lessons that Texas supporters should take from the struggle that's happening in Puerto Rico right now. So don't go anywhere. Hey, thanks so much for joining me for another episode of the Texas News Podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Miller, president of the Texas Nationalist Movement, and I got to tell you, I'm really excited about today's episode. I get an opportunity to interview a leading advocate, as I said, for Puerto Rico's independence. But it's always a good time for me when I get to interview people who effectively do what I do here in Texas, but for their respective state, territory, province, whatever it is. And, you know, we've had some pretty phenomenal interviews in the past. I mean, we've interviewed advocates from New Hampshire. We've interviewed advocates from California. We've got interviews coming up with the head of the movement in the Western Cape in South Africa. And I mean, it just goes on and on. We've got an interview coming up with the leader of the Free Louisiana movement. So, you know, it's always a good opportunity, I think, for us to be able to take a look at the issues of self-government and self-determination as they are unfolding in other places in the world. You know, it's not uncommon for us to talk about on this particular podcast or when I'm out speaking or on interviews, talking about how prevalent the push for self-determination is all around the world. You know, one of the statistics I quote all the time is from John Nesbitt's book, Global Paradox, where he talks about the end of World War II. There were roughly 54 recognized countries, and by the time of the book's publication, there were 192. So we know that self-determination is pretty prevalent around the world. And of course, when we can bring that focus here in our own backyard, I think it really lends a lot of additional context to what we're doing here in Texas. I mean, obviously on these podcasts, we're talking about various news and current events through the lens of Texas independence and through that perspective. But it is really interesting to note how much these movements favor in some of their core ideology, some of their core worldview. And that may sound odd to people, but when you break it all down, it really is just a people striving to have the right of self-government, the right of self-determination to determine how they are governed and by whom. And Puerto Rico is a really interesting case study of this. You know, when we talk about things like movements outside of Texas, you could typically throw them into two different piles, right? You've got your international movements like Scotland or Catalonia or the Brexit movement or any of those things. And then you have these state movements or provincial movements like we have with Nuevo Leon, Mexico, or Alberta, Canada, or California or New Hampshire or Louisiana. But Puerto Rico is one that's kind of in between. And I will confess that going into this interview, I did not know as much about Puerto Rico as I really should have. And that is a shame on me. You know, I try to keep up with as many as I can. But, you know, I wasn't really aware of a lot of the history dealing with Puerto Rico independence movement. I've known a good bit. I know a good bit about sort of what's happening modern times, but never really pulled back the lid on their motivations for independence and a lot of the rationale that they have. And when I say that Puerto Rico is caught in between, it's because of their status. They are essentially a colony, a throwback to something in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And And there's so much. And so I thought it would be important to have a guest on to talk about this, because as we're recording this, there's been a lot of news breaking about Puerto Rico. There was an article that was published in the Daily Mail a few days ago talking about a draft executive order that had been circulating around that essentially, without trying to, I guess, get into spoiler territory, but there was a draft executive order that's been circulating around offices in Congress and some of the cabinet secretaries and officers in the White House that would allow Donald Trump with a single signature to effectively send Puerto Rico on a path to independence, and in the process save taxpayers somewhere in the neighborhood of about $617 billion, which is that was the figure according to the Daily Mail. So I thought it important to invite someone that I am acquainted with to talk more about this issue. And we've got Javier Hernandez, who I came across because of the publication of his book called PRexit, PRexit, and essentially laying out the case for independence in Puerto Rico. Now, if you've been paying attention on the TNM news site, news.tnm.me, you will see that we have occasionally had articles in the international engagement section of TNM News highlighting some of the things that were happening about Puerto Rico. And of course, a lot of that news came through or was introduced to us through Javier. So Javier is not only an author, he is a well-educated, he's I mean, the guy's got credentials a mile long, but what's I think important here is that he is a massive public and vocal advocate for Puerto Rican independence. And so I've got Javier on here today, where he and I are going to try to unpack this and make what's happening in Puerto Rico make sense for everyone that listens to or watches this podcast. Well, hey, Javier, thank you so much for joining me on the Texas News Podcast. Why don't you begin by telling everyone a little bit about you?
Yeah, thank you. I'm Javier Hernandez. I'm a Puerto Rican writer, author, and pro-independence advocate for Puerto Rico. I support many sovereignty efforts and initiatives and projects. I'm involved with many organizations. I was born in Puerto Rico, but I was raised in the United States. I've had teaching experience. I've also worked with the federal government, and I love agriculture. That's one of my little passions. But all in all, I'm very committed to the Puerto Rican independence, sovereignty issue. I do my best when it involves really working towards that goal. I have relationships with many other people, organizations in Puerto Rico and in the U.S., with other Puerto Rican organizations in the U.S., of course, and
Right.
others. And yeah, so that's pretty much my little bio there. I published a book in 2018. It's called PRexit, Forging Puerto Rico's Path to Sovereignty. And that's the book that launched other books and articles and turned me into, I guess, a Puerto Rico expert, especially in the
Well,
field of the topic of sovereignty. Yep.
well, it's a good thing that we know a Puerto Rico expert, because Puerto Rico's been in the news an awful lot the past few days. But before we get ahead, no spoilers. I want to give you an opportunity to really introduce the listeners and the viewers to the issue of Puerto Rican independence. I mean, we know some about Puerto Rico. By and large, I think generally what they hear, or what most people hear, is they hear the pro-statehood side of the issue. It's always about Puerto Rico statehood. And I would venture a guess and say that the vast majority of people that are in Texas and the rest of the United States aren't even really aware that there is a massive movement for Puerto Rico to just get outright independence. So if you could just kind of give our listeners a thumbnail sketch of what the situation with Puerto Rico is, how it got to this point, and kind of where the independence movement is.
Well, thank you. Yeah. Growing up in the US, I remember when I looked at US history books, there was only a little not even a paragraph, maybe 3 sentences of regarding Puerto Rico. It was a Spanish colony, the US invaded in 1898, and that's it. Everyone's happy and next. That was nothing
Right.
else. Nothing else. And again, of course, there's so much history, but many people, Americans, don't know about it. Not their fault. It's just it's not really taught or focused on in any history class. In fact, I remember getting in trouble by bringing it up to in New Jersey in 1990s New Jersey high school, bringing it up in class. And how dare I? And I got into the principal's office. But that was 1993, I believe that occurred.
That
But
that probably happened because you exposed a teacher's blind spot. It's like, don't ask questions about this because I don't know.
exactly. And so I mean, Puerto Rican independence is a very old. It's not just some new thing that came up 20 years ago. We've been trying to get our independence from Spain. All right, I mean, hundreds of years ago, our first independence revolt was 1868, Grito de Lares in the mountain town of Lares, and we took over the town, declared the Republic of Puerto Rico, had a provisional government established, all that, but the Spanish forces were too much. The Patriots were defeated, but that was the first time that was like really fighting for our independence. And from that moment on, pro-independence has been an issue, a major issue in Puerto Rican history. Again, with Spain, pretty much then that led to the abolition of slavery and other reforms. Then towards the end, like in 1897, Spain granted Puerto Rico a charter of autonomy that gave us a lot of autonomy, still somewhat connected with Spain, but we had a lot of freedom, political freedom, diplomatic relations with other countries. I mean, and the irony is, during that time, that it was like a few months where we had that charter of autonomy, we had more freedom, political and economic, and even democratic, with monarchical Spain than we've ever had with the US. It's amazing.
It's not shocking, not shocking for me. It may be shocking for some other people out there, but for me, and for people that are promoting self determination and independence, that we don't find that shocking at all.
I know it's incredible. And then we were invaded by the US in 1898. There's the Spanish-American War. I mean, people know about that. But then it's like Puerto Rico's invaded. Okay, then next, move on. No, but for us, that started a whole new chapter in our history. So Spain's gone, the Spanish chapter is over. But now instead of being free, now we have another chapter, another colonial chapter. Now it's the US colonial era. And that began during that invasion. And since then, I mean, it's been hard. It's been hard for pro-independence. Our currency was devalued, then later abolished. Our autonomous government was banned, was dissolved, and the U.S. put a military dictatorship in there until 1900. Then the Foraker Act came, put in a colonial civil government in place that lasted a few years. 1917, the U.S. added more democratic aspects to it, and then also imposed U.S. citizenship. Now, I say imposed because many times, and the stateholders will say this in history books, they always say that we were granted, as if that was, oh, thank you so much. We're so appreciative. Thank you, master, for that. But they always fail to mention that Puerto Rico's only elected representatives, the legislature in Puerto Rico was elected by Puerto Ricans, unanimously opposed to U.S. citizenship. We didn't want it. In 1914, we're like, good, thank you, we're good. We want to just be Puerto Ricans. 1917 rolled around. The U.S. needed more bodies for World War I. So guess where they got those bodies? Puerto Rico, right?
Right.
So we got U.S. citizenship, and as soon as we got it, 1 week later, all right, ship off to Europe. Let's go die in Europe.
Wow.
And since then, we've been U.S. citizens ever since. And so then the independence movement started rising up in the 20s, especially in the 30s,
Right.
And then that's when the real persecution, real repression began. I mean, it was really, really rough. There was the 1935 Rio Piedras massacre, and then the bigger one was the 1937 Ponce massacre. All right, and that was the time when the U.S. would appoint American usually like some American military general who usually hated Puerto Ricans to be the governor of Puerto Rico. Okay, so they'd go there and just hard ironclad with machine guns impose U.S. rule. You know, they did not tolerate any democracy at all. No Puerto Rican pride, no nationalism, no nothing. Everything was just, it's our way or the highway, or you're gonna die. And that was like that for ages and ages. Our leadership was arrested, either killed off, disappeared, and then after World War II. Now again, I'm jumping different eras and different things
Right.
that occurred. But during all this time, 30s, 40s, 50s, there's been a lot of repression. Then in they started getting a specific political leader, Luis Muñoz Marin, and he was pro-independence, but he got co-opted. So he began to be more pro-autonomy. And then he was given more power and leeway with the U.S., but the nationalists were very still powerful. They were growing, engaging, more active, in defiance of U.S. colonial, policies in Puerto Rico, which included language. They used to try to impose English, and we were resisting English. That was a whole segment of our history that would entail a whole new podcast just to discuss that.
Right.
But pretty much in 1948, the government of Puerto Rico imposed, it's called the gag law. Okay, it's like law 53 in Spanish, La Ley de la Mordaza, and literally outlawed, plain out and simple, outlawed pro-independent speech, activism. The flag was illegal. Our own national flag was illegal in our own country, right? Many people arrested. If you were found to have a Puerto Rican flag, in possession of a Puerto Rican flag from 1948 onward to 1953, you would get, 10 years in prison, $10,000 fine, maybe. It was harsh. And
Well,
it was,
okay. Well, hang on, hang on.
yeah,
And
yeah.
I just want to make sure that we don't skip over this for the benefit of those out there listening. Maybe you just maybe if you're listening, you're just kind of checking off the boxes for the history. I want you to be really, really clear about what Javier just said. They essentially forced U.S. citizenship on them so they could draft them, so they could go fight for the United States military. And then in 1948, their flag was outlawed. The promotion of the idea of independence was outlawed, right?
Yep.
Things we look at here and say, well, wait a minute, don't we have rights under the First Amendment to the Constitution? Don't we have a right to free speech? And so what he's describing here, and just correct me if I'm wrong, Javier, but essentially what you're talking about here is the federal government, under the guise of wanting to suppress the independence narrative, was perfectly willing to throw the Constitution and constitutional rights in the wood chipper. I got that right.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Not just the wood chipper, but burn it entirely.
Yeah. Well,
It's
I
amazing.
think we could have a whole other podcast about how far back the federal system's willingness to disregard the Constitution goes. But it's manifest in the story, and I think it's probably very difficult for people to get their heads around that the federal government. We talk about in this era of shadow banning, and the Twitter files were a big deal, where the federal government was censoring, forcing the social media giants to pull accounts or suppress certain things. Guys, that was all done in the shadows. Imagine for a moment if you're in Puerto Rico and you want to hoist up your national standard. You want to hoist up your flag, or you want to go to someone, much like what we do here in Texas, and go, hey, don't you think Puerto Rico would be much better off as an independent nation? Boom, it's against the law. What were the penalties? What were the penalties for violating that law, Javier?
The outright penalties were 10 years in prison and or $10,000 fine, which imagine in the 1940s and 50s, that was a huge amount of money.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and I'll tell you, the timing of that's pretty interesting as well, because that was, that comes right on the heels of the United States signing the UN Charter, and you have an explicit recognition of the right of self determination, and essentially what kicked off all the decolonialization efforts. Um, but before we get to sort of beyond the gag law, because obviously it had an expiration date. Um, I just let me just say this, because a lot of what you're talking about sounds very much like the territorial status that Puerto Rico has is very much a relic of the past, right? As you're telling this story, it's very reminiscent of Britain and, say, Ireland, or Britain and India. Where you have these massacres, this use of force, this suppression of the right to even entertain publicly the idea of self government and self rule. This sounds very familiar, but it's a lot closer to where we are in our timeline than, say, India's independence was, or Irish independence, the Irish War for Independence. Would you say that the people in Puerto Rico are looking at this relationship as a bit of an anachronism as well?
Well, of course, many were, but if you were and you were vocal about it, something would happen to you. You would lose your job, you would get persecuted, and if you were too vocal, you would just disappear.
Right.
So there was a climate of fear and terror that that was so strong. It was a colonial dictatorship, plain and simple. And that fear was instilled back then. It's still alive today. You still have people who are, if you put a flag up, some neighbors, hey, be careful, something will happen to you. Shh, like you still have that. This is 2025, and
Right.
you still have that, especially older folks, not too much the younger folks, older folks who remember that era are still in impregnated with that fear, instilled with
Mm,
that, and it's sad to see that. Yeah.
yeah, that's terrible. Well, so, we move past the gag law. I mean, obviously there has been, and I alluded to this at the very beginning of our conversation, in that people hear a lot in the media about statehood. It's one of those things. We hear the drumbeat: DC statehood, Puerto Rico statehood, and currently Puerto Rico exists as a territory, and you guys have had multiple referendums, some very questionable. um, I'm sure we'll dive into that. But where the options are essentially independence, statehood, or free association. Um, why don't let's talk about that referendum process, and what it's like for Puerto Rico to have to go through this kind of rinse and repeat cycle of what seems to be an electoral deadlock on the issue of its status.
Well, before even starting on that, let's describe the first referendum on status, first plebiscite, you could say, was 1967. So it was decades after the U.S. was already there. Why couldn't they have a referendum 1930 to 1925? No,
Yeah.
because independence could have won. So the U.S. did not allow any referendums during that time. They had to do the terror, had to really, really scare the people. That takes a few decades or years to really, really instill fear in colonial rule. Then, once you're confident that they are terrified of their own freedom, then you allow the referendum.
Right.
Exactly. And then in 1967, and I should mention, in 1950, there was a revolution, a legit, actual, like, a revolt against U.S. rule. Towns were taken over. The U.S. had to call in the National Guard. Oh, they needed more forces. The U.S. Army got involved. Jets were bombing. So this is actually the first time the U.S. bombed its own citizens. They
Wow.
bombed the towns of Jayuya and Utuado in the mountains. those are U.S. citizens, and they're dropping bombs on them to stop the revolt. And that's something that is not mentioned. And then 1952 was when the Commonwealth was created, right on the heels of the decolonization of Africa and Asia and all that.
Right.
But they wanted to hang on to it, but still say that you decolonized. So then that's when they came up with the whole notion of Commonwealth, which is we feel. I mean, even back then they knew this, and it's still today. It's colonial rule. It's like a colony with a really pretty name, Commonwealth. That sounds really beautiful. The Commonwealth. But when you look at what it is and what it does and where's the source of its sovereignty, it's still a colony. It's plain and simple. So that's where we are today. And they started the plebiscites in 1967 just to give a validity to the Commonwealth itself. And now remember, you're 60 something years after the US was there, 60 years of repression, persecution. You're going to have now a whole generation, even two generations, who have been silenced. There's fear, and that if you're pro-independence, you disappear,
Right.
So that led to the support of Commonwealth. And then, but even after that, independence was still repressed. It wasn't out in the open like that, but it was still happening. And that affected thousands of people. People still disappeared. There's persecutions, police files on you. If you were pro-independent, if you had a Puerto Rican flag, you'd get a police file on you called the carpeta. And the carpetas, it was like the federal government was involved in this, also the Puerto Rican local government. So that helped create a fear. There's still a climate of fear and terror to support independence, especially for those older generations. Exactly.
Unreal. Well, I'm gonna fast forward because we're obviously we have a limited amount of time. I would love to tear into this for hours. I mean, I think this is fascinating because look, what you're doing is you're giving everyone the education about Puerto Rico that they didn't get in school. Right? I mean,
Exactly.
so we're trying to cover an awful lot of history and give a lot of context, and that's really what I wanted to start off with, because look, there have been some major developments as of late, and I want to get to that. So kind of catch us up to, obviously there was a news story that broke in the Daily Mail. I guess it was on Friday, where there is an executive order circulating around, at least a draft of one, that may or may not be in the hands of Donald Trump. I mean, the Daily Mail article wasn't particularly clear about that, but you've got this draft executive order that would essentially kick Puerto Rico its walking papers and say, "Look, guys, let's give you guys the independence that you want. Why don't you talk about sort of what that news was about, what the Daily Mail was talking about, and we can break down that draft executive order."
Perfect. Thank you. So, around the beginning of February, there was a memo that went out first that I helped co-author with another group in DC. It was explaining the different options. There were the three options that the U.S. president could do via executive power to further Puerto Rico's independence and decolonization. That went out. It circulated congressional offices, made some influence. An article was published about it in the DC Journal. It got viral. It became big news in Puerto Rico, and then it just kind of went quiet. Well, it didn't go that quiet, because then because of that memo, it inspired an organization, a group of people to come together, and which I'm part of that group, and help write what would be a draft executive order to really, really show and start a conversation with the U.S. Not just hey, we want independence, but here it is. Here's the draft. This does not need to be the final version. That have to be negotiated at some point. But here's a draft of what would be Donald Trump could sign literally and make this happen. Executive order for Puerto Rico to become a viable independent nation. And it has all the intricacies, all the details of how to make that happen. And of course, it's a draft, and it was made by me and others in Puerto Rico. We sent it to many congressional offices, and then through there, it also went to White House, circulating, and then the Daily Mail published it. We're super grateful that that came out. And as you can imagine, that became that created a political firestorm in Puerto Rico, and it's still going on.
Which is that's what I was about to say. It's as I think you and I follow one another on X.
Yeah.
And because of that, anytime something is hitting about Puerto Rico, the algorithm knows that it says, "Hey, we think you might be interested in this." So my feed is since that Daily Mail article hit, my feed has been absolutely full. And I got to tell you, my Spanish is horrible, so thank goodness for the translate this post button, the option. But anyway, yeah, I mean, it's that thing has really, really blown up. And I'll tell you, my observation has been, what was mentioned in the Daily Mail article that I think is capturing the attention of a lot of people, especially in this era of Trump and Musk, wanting to trim as much fat as possible, as much looking for things to not spend money on any longer, was the quote, and I believe it was like $617 billion
Yep.
just by, that the United States federal government would save just by going through this process and recognizing the independence of Puerto Rico. Can you speak to that?
Yes. So currently, and these are numbers from usspending.gov. All right. So these are, I'm not winging these numbers. These are from the government itself. Also, there's the Government Accountability Office report from 2014 with numbers about statehood. And that report literally says how statehood would be disastrous for the Puerto Rican and U.S. economies. And there's also information from the Wall Street Journal about what statehood would entail. So right now, the current Commonwealth of Puerto Rico territorial government costs the U.S., according to their own data, about $40 billion, right? $40 billion a year to run a corrupt colonial territorial government that is still mired in poverty, dependency. People still have a few people still have blue tarps on their roof from 2017 hurricanes. All that money and gets siphoned off by the pro statehood and the pro Commonwealth politicians that maintain poverty in Puerto Rico because they live off that. They profit. They love dependency. They love poverty because it keeps them in power. So it takes $40 billion to run Puerto Rico, and that's federal funding, right? If statehood were to happen, which would be a disaster, according to the Gal report from the U.S. Congress itself, okay, it would be $50 billion. So you're going to have $50 billion that'll increase the dependency, increase the poverty, just so some Democrats can say that they have a blue state, right? And sadly, instead of focusing on freedom and democracy and self-determination of peoples, some Democrats are naively, they buy into the whole, Puerto Ricans are Americans, we're pro-Latino. So they think that by supporting statehood, they're being pro-Latino when ironically, what they're really doing is saying, we don't believe you should exist as a nation. So we're going to absorb you, annex you, and destroy your culture and make you part of the USA, so that you all speak English and be like us. And that's what we don't want. We don't want that to happen. We don't believe in assimilation, for our nation. And we would be saying the same thing if it were France or Russia. It's not a US thing. It's just we don't want to be colonized by anyone. So pretty much that's the situation with the spending. So it's 50 billion for statehood. Now, if you go long term, if the US does nothing right now and just keep the Commonwealth as it is, 40 billion, in 50 years, the US will spend over $1.4 trillion on Puerto Rico to keep it as a corrupt, bankrupt, poor colony.
Right.
If it were a state, to maintain the poorest state in the union, right, it would become the poorest state in the union with more dependency and more, food stamps and all that because of the poverty that would be created through statehood. It would be over $2 trillion that the U.S. would blow on this 51st state. All right. If the U.S. decides on independence, all that is gone. The U.S. would save approximately, and these numbers are from our economists, it would save over $617 billion that the U.S. economy, that the U.S. government, not even economy, the U.S. government would save, and instead invest that money in its own people, instead of blowing all that money in a faraway colonial property. That
So,
was Puerto Rico.
Javier, I think, for me, one of the things, I mean, I have my theories, uh, but why in the world is the federal government fighting so hard to either leave Puerto Rico in neutral or to make it a state? I mean, is it a pride thing? Is it, what? Because there's no math where it makes sense, right? So what is the purpose? What so, I'm not asking you for inside information, but your perspective on it. Why do you think they kind of fight tooth and nail to either leave Puerto Rico status as is or for statehood?
There are certain business interests that benefit from the colonial arrangement. They make a lot of money, and but there's always been like an undercurrent of American politicians who don't want statehood. They want to solve this, but every time it gets close to being solved, or at least starting to negotiate something, the monkey wrench gets tossed in, or we call it the poison pill:
Mhm.
statehood. Statehood. The second statehood is introduced into the negotiation with Congress, every negotiation stalls and breaks down, and it's over. And it's usually the what happened in the late '90s. There was like a negotiation about Puerto Rico status. It was getting very, very good. It was a lot of information was coming out, a lot of cooperation from Congress and from Puerto Rico. And the thing that broke it, the thing that really, really knocked it out, was the stakeholders' insistence that they decide, that Puerto Rico decide whether it becomes a state, that the U.S. should not decide whether it gets a state or not. No, you
Yeah,
don't decide that. You
that's
don't. Can I vote to live in your house, Daniel? Can I just
exactly
vote? No, exactly. No, you decide who lives in your house, right? So the U.S. decides what states or territories become states. These stakeholders believe that, oh, but we got them, we got 60%, 70% voting to become a state. That means nothing. Nothing. The U.S. decides who enters their union, not you. That's the issue. That So
right,
whenever they get into this, tit for tat in Congress, it gets so complicated. They just stop it and just move on. And
right.
that's been the usual thing from the '90s onward to 2000s, and now we're at this situation. And sadly, and also I do have to say, there are some stakeholders that they have a lot of money. They have some capital. They
Mm,
buy loyal. I'm not loyalists, lobbyists,
yeah,
and they go through Congress. They like to talk about Puerto Ricans and how we benefit the union. Blah 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 blah. But then in Puerto Rico, what they really talk about, this is what they don't say to Americans, right? To you, they would say, oh, we are men and women fought in uniform for the country. All this, patriotic,
right.
red, white, and blue talk, right? In Puerto Rico, it's not. It's not that. It's, oh my God, how much money are we gonna get off these gringos? That's literally how they talk. We're gonna
Wow.
get $10 billion in more federal money. That's more food stamps, more Section 8, more. I mean, believe me, these stakeholders are experts when it comes to siphoning off federal funds. Many of them have been arrested by the FBI. I mean, corruption schemes. They are really, really, like, really bad for
Yeah.
Puerto Rico's future and for the U.S. itself. Exactly.
Unreal, unreal.
Mhm.
Well, so where do we go from here? What is gonna, with this draft EO that's blown up, what's next for sort of the Puerto Rican independence movement?
What's next is, now the next step, what we're trying to get accomplished, is we're getting more meetings with certain congressional offices. This is being discussed. It's getting more media. I've seen through social media also that a lot of Americans are supporting this, which is great. I mean, once you get into the whole, the U.S. could save how much, that opens up a lot of eyes, and many people are beginning to realize, like, there's no reason really for the U.S. to hold on to Puerto Rico. It's losing money. It's not a good deal. How Trump would
Right.
say, well, it's not a good deal. The good deal is independence, because with independence we would finally have control of our own economy, develop as a nation, create our own economic policies, have international trade, access to global markets, create jobs, have great relationship with the U.S. on a nation to nation basis. That's what we want. That's what
There
we
you go.
want.
Look,
Exactly.
it's the same argument that we make here. It's the same argument that they make in Cali, the same argument they make in New Hampshire. Look, at the end of the day, Puerto Rico could become independent, execute a trade agreement with the United States, execute a travel arrangements or travel agreement, enter into a mutual defense compact, and it would effectively be the same relationship, with the exception that Puerto Rico has self-government, no strings attached, and the federal government's going to save somewhere in the neighborhood, I think what you said, upward in the next 50 years of over $1 trillion. So, it's really that same discussion that so many of us have about, we don't have to be a part of the United States to still be friends and still work together and still trade with one another. The difference is that we do those things, but neither one of us has to bow to the other one and surrender our sovereignty to the other one. And in the end, the highest value that you get out of I guess the biggest benefit you get from self-government is self-government.
Exactly. Exactly. And once we have self-government, then we can finally have a democracy. Because right now we have no democracy. Because in Puerto Rico, they have some people say, oh, we have democracy because we have elections. And so every 4 years, we elect
Yeah.
more colonial politicians that have no power. Because
Yeah.
right now, the Puerto Rico sovereignty doesn't rest with Puerto Ricans; it rests in Congress. So
Right.
we have no. In fact, the U.S. has so much control over Puerto Rico. I mean, we're property. I mean, Puerto Rico's issues in Congress, they're not dealt with by the Senate Committee on Territories, or it's the Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources. We're just real estate in the Caribbean that happen to
Wow.
have Puerto Ricans on it. That's literally how the Congress sees us for the past 126 years. We're not for them, we're not a nation. We're just a bunch of Homo sapiens that speak Spanish. Some of us are brown, some of us are white. We're like Latin American, and we live on this little rock on the Caribbean. That's how many congressmen see us. But we're a nation. We're a Latin American Caribbean nation, our own history, our own nationality, flag, literature, everything. We're everything a nation could be, except we don't have political sovereignty. And that's what we've been fighting for against Spain. We're against US colonial policies. And we
Yeah.
would continue doing this, even with another. If France would come in, we would continue the same struggle.
Right.
Yeah. So I mean, the U.S. has even tried to sell Puerto Rico. The U.S. can, like, we're such a property. The U.S. can literally sell Puerto Rico and not tell Puerto Ricans, and we would only find out the next day when the French or the Danish would appear, like,
When the
and
new
say
landlord shows up.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. Just like
Unreal.
slaves used to be bought and sold,
Yeah.
colonies could be bought and sold. Yep.
Unreal. Well, Javier, I know our time is limited, so let me get down to kind of my final question.
Yep.
Obviously the people that are watching or listening, uh, probably going to be a little skewed toward pro Texas independence. So, what message do you have for Texas independence supporters? Whether it's something that they could take away from the experience here, or the reason why they should really kind of get all in on Puerto Rican independence. What is your message to them today?
The message is that we can cooperate with each other, we can help each other, and we can learn from each other. I mean, our struggle is different than Texas, because you guys are already a state, so there's other issues involved in legal matters and all that. But the fact that we both want the best for our people, that is key. And in terms of helping people realize that, is having a plan, and that's something that I've been helping and working towards, showing how Puerto Rico can survive economically. Have like books on that, because many of the issues that we've come across are, without the U.S. we will die of hunger the next day. That type of mentality. And then when I write books and literally show with economic data that if Puerto Rico were independent, with a 10% tariff on all imports, we could run the entire government and more.
Right.
Just that, not even other taxes or fees. Just that would be enough to fund everything. Yeah. So something that, I mean, maybe in the Texas movement can do is to help people realize the economic power that Texas can hold. I mean, Texas would be a major economic power in North America if its funds weren't being fleeced by the federal government, and it's losing, resources and all that. But so
Right.
those are things that we can work on together in the future.
Yeah, it's interesting. We tell people all the time, look, if Texas can't make it as an independent nation, then no one can, right? I mean, we're the eighth largest economy in the world. But what you said just reminded me, and I've mentioned his name on this podcast plenty of times before, so I can imagine some of the listeners slash viewers are going to roll their eyes. But Dr. Thomas Naylor, professor emeritus of economics at Duke University, founder of the Second Vermont Republic, the late Dr. Naylor was always about politics of scale. I mean, that's, kind of, that was his wheelhouse. But the one thing that he said that I think is applicable and that I really wish would sink into the heads of people is that there's this misconception out there that independence should be predicated upon sustain. I guess you could call it self-sufficiency, right? There is this misconception that should be the criteria for independence, but there's not a single self-governing entity on the planet that is 100% self-sufficient, right? Welcome to the 21st century where trade is king. And guess what? That's not a new phenomena either. There's not been a single self-sufficient, self-governing, independent nation on the planet ever. Okay. So we need to stop thinking in terms of this idea of self-sufficiency and look at just what Javier was saying, which is it's and what Dr. Naylor was saying, which is it's not about self-sufficiency, it's about viability, right? Is this a viable entity? And there's one thing that and this is important about the 21st century, is that technology has become the force multiplier, and even the smallest places can be the biggest players. I mean, look, Liechtenstein exists. Okay. The fact that it actually exists should
Yeah.
say that anyone can do this. Anyone.
Singapore also.
Singapore. I mean, another great example. Look, all you have to have is the political will to secure your political, cultural, and economic independence. And that's what you got, right? I mean, so, where Texas is, where Puerto Rico is, where New Hampshire and California and Vermont and Alaska and all these others that are attached to that federal behemoth, we all have phenomenal cases as to why we should be independent. The only thing standing between us and independence is really the will of the people. And I got to tell you, Javier, I'm just all of this news that's been blowing up over the past few days. I'm just over the moon for you guys, man. I am very excited about where this could lead.
Thank you, Daniel. No, and I really appreciate the support of it. Being on this podcast is great. And I ask, everyone who's listening to this and watching this, please, support our movement, Puerto Rican independence. It's not just good economically and politically for the U.S., but it'll help the U.S. actually, and hopefully one day Texas, gain an ally in the Caribbean, Latin American ally. And if we can do it, you guys can do it.
Well, phenomenal. Well, Javier, tell everyone where they can find out more information and connect up with you.
I pretty much work off X, so you can find me at PRexit Book, PRexitBook, PRexit Book. Basically, I started that handle when I started the books. But yeah, so from there you can message me, DM me, and we could start conversation.
Well, fantastic. Well, Javier, thank you so much. Really appreciate you being here. Very fascinating discussion. And you look, I would wish you luck, but you don't need luck. You just need time. So
Thank you.
go get them, Tiger.
Thank you. We're doing it. We're doing it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, again, a big thank you to Javier Hernandez. You heard what he said. If you want to learn more about what he's doing, you can go follow him over on X, or pick up a copy of his book, PRexit, PRexit. And it's a fascinating read. But hopefully you're like I am, and really picked up a lot of information that you didn't know. I mean, I wasn't kidding when I was talking to him and said, look, they don't talk about this. This is not something we learn in government class or history class. And it's a weird, very weird situation. Puerto Rico is caught in sort of this limbo, right? This kind of in-between land. And I think from the history that we see of Puerto Rico's relationship with the United States, in their quest for independence, I think there are a lot of lessons there for folks like us, right? For folks that want to see Texas as a free, independent, self-governing nation state. And so I'm just very grateful that Javier took the time out to visit with us today. Looking forward to seeing what the developments are on that front. And look, I am open to having Javier on again to drill down on some of this information, but I want to hear from you. Are there things that you would like to learn from Javier, or is there anything in particular about Puerto Rico's independence movement that really that you would like to unpack a little bit more? If so, wherever you're watching or listening to this, drop it in the comments and let us know. I would be absolutely willing to have him on again, or even do a special live stream for members of the Texas Nationalist Movement where he can unpack some of this. So I would just say based on what Javier's saying, I would suggest keeping your eyes on the news. I don't think that this is the last that we have heard on this issue, not by a long shot. So anyway, big thanks to Javier Hernandez, and thank you all for tuning in today. I'd like to invite each and every one of you, if you would like to see us reach more people and help us keep pumping out content just like this, where you're going to get deep dives. You're not going to get what you just got anywhere else. Then what we need you to do is become a member of the Texas Nationalist Movement today. Head over to tnm.me/join and become a member. You can become a member of the TNM for as little as $4.21. And, frankly, that helps us. That helps us continue to produce content like this, expand that content, go out there and make progress on the legislative front, to organize locally, to do all of the things that we need to do to make Texas a free, independent, self-governing nation again. A big congratulations are in order as well for both Cherokee County and Walker County. As we have talked about on here previously, we are in the middle of a massive organizational effort out in the counties, forming county organizations, getting ready to get and win a referendum on independence. And so over the weekend, Cherokee County and Walker County have become the two newest counties to complete their training and are getting ready for launch. They joined Angelina County, which has already launched. And there are an additional 60, almost 70 counties that are in some status of organizing as we speak right now. This is a massive undertaking, and we need your help. So if you have an opportunity, head over to local.tnm.me and get connected up with your county right now. Let's get this thing done. 254 counties throughout Texas. Let's nail down organizations in every single solitary one of them. So with that, we will, I guess that's a wrap, right? That's a wrap on this week's Texas News Podcast. So again, thank you so very much for listening. And I will leave you with the words I leave you with every time we're together. They're the words of Sam Houston when he said that Texas will again lift its head and stand among the nations. I believe that time is now. And the question is, will you stand with her?